Hey there and welcome back to another Stranger Things video. And today, I want to talk about the release of the second volume of Season 4, because I have a lot of feelings about this, and not all of them are good. Now don't get me wrong, I don't think the second volume was necessarily bad, but I do think it was held back by the writing in a number of ways, and honestly, when I first watched it, I was gripped the whole way through. There were moments here and there where I had to pause the episode to let out a big sigh of disappointment, but for the most part, I enjoyed the experience immensely. But then I sat back and I started thinking about things a bit more, and I just couldn't help but have this big feeling of disappointment with how they wrap things up. Like, I'm still hyped for Season 5 and all, but now I'm sitting here looking back on the awesomeness that was Volume 1 of Season 4, and then Volume 2's just sitting there like, eh. But anyway, enough vague complaining. We'll start off with the things I didn't particularly like, and then finish off with the fun stuff to send us off on a high. But yeah, like, spoilers. So let's start off with the big boy. Character deaths. Spoiler alert, go away if you don't want spoilers. Last chance. Okay. Eddie died, and I loved Eddie. Eddie was awesome. And I think killing Eddie was a mistake. It was wasteful. And I don't know, it was a bit of a cop-out for me, I guess. And yeah, I get I'm a fan of the character, and you might argue that makes me a bit biased, a bit of a blind fanboy. But honestly, I really liked Barb and Bob and Alexi as well. They were fun characters too. And honestly, they did need to die for the story to progress. Barb had to kickstart Nancy's entire arc. Bob and Alexi were kind of loose ends that needed to be tied off. They would have cluttered things with their presence in later seasons. But I do not think the same thing applies to Eddie. I think he had more of a story to tell and a place in the narrative going forward. He was just such a unique character compared to some of the very vanilla and samey characters we've got going on. He was a breath of fresh air. And they killed him off because what? They didn't know what to do with him? Because he was an accused serial killer? Like, isn't Al already on the run now? They would have been a very fun duo to have living in a cabin in the woods together, but no. Let's kill him off instead. But that's not all, because they also had to kind of hit him with the idiot stick to actually successfully kill him off. For some reason, he decides that sacrificing himself to the bats is going to be helpful. Like, what? Like, I get they have this vague don't run away motif, but wouldn't it have been better to, I don't know, keep running with Dustin? To keep distracting the bats? They're doing all of this to ensure that Nancy, Steve, and Robin make it to Vecna and kill him successfully. But Eddie leads them back away from the gate, back towards Nancy, Robin, and Steve, into the Upside Down. So what if they, I don't know, just go back to the house after they kill him? Then 3 more people would have been trapped and killed, and it would have been his fault just so he could have his I didn't run away this time storyline. Also, they went to a weapons store. No guns for the boys that have to fight the bats? Look, this is the USA. Everybody knows that in modern day USA, there's almost no gun regulations. Anyone can buy an assault weapon. Surely the 1980s was no different. If a little girl can walk around through a store like this on her own, putting shit in her wagon, surely they could have got some better weapons for Dustin and Eddie, instead of just spears and shields. Nice. Also, according to my very, very brief research, you can apparently buy flamethrowers in the USA. They're not even considered weapons apparently, but tools. Now that horrifying revelation aside for a moment, surely that means you could buy one in the 80s, right? Did they not sell them back then? And even if not, would these kids not know how to build one using the stuff they could buy? What's the point in having nerds on your side if they don't think of shit like this? I mean, they already know that fire hurts these things the most. They make Molotovs to fight Vecna for fuck's sake. So having a flamethrower to kill the swarm of bats feels like it makes just too much sense. No one had to die if they weren't stupid. And on top of that, it's yet another example of them killing off the new character simply to try and get an emotional response whilst not taking a risk by getting rid of a main character. Hopper is the only time they did that, and even then he was clearly not dead, even that episode, because you saw him in the post-credits scene, or at least saw a hint of him. So at this stage, why should I ever believe the main characters are in any sort of mortal peril? Why should I care they're in any sort of danger when there's no proof that any of them, at any point in time, are at any proper risk? And if there's a new character, why would I bother getting attached to them? Why would I bother caring about them? They're just there for the cheap death after all. So it really lessens the suspense when the majority of the characters just have straight up plot armor. Like seriously, Nancy, Steve, and Robin were getting straight up strangled for what felt like half the finale, and they were just fine. not even bruised around their throats. Steve was bitten by bats in Volume 1, completely fine. Lucas is beaten to the point that he shouldn't have still been standing. He's just a teenager. He got walloped. And he ducks under a gunshot like he's James Bond or some shit. Max straight up dies and was resurrected somehow. Like, I know she's in a coma, but let's be real, how long's that gonna last? And I mean, realistically, I could also see there being little to no consequences from that. Even though I feel like surely he would have attacked her spine. Surely she'd be crippled. Or at least blind, judging from her milky eyes at the end. But I could see them just being like, no, she's fine. And so this does bring me to Max. And God, her storyline this season was so good! And the second volume was no exception. But I just can't help but think killing her was fucking dumb. Like, I know they needed to open the portal for the ending, but killing a character and bringing them back to life, that just ain't it, Chief. Having her just have her snapped bones and blinded eyes seems like it would have been enough for me. I mean, you could easily write your way out of this and bullshit your way to the finale. It just feels like they wanted to have that emotional response of a main character dying, and then none of the consequences. Like, don't get me wrong, I love Max. I didn't want her to die, I'm not a psycho, but it happened. And if they were brave enough to do it, be brave enough to stay the course with it. And I mean, I just pray that she's not fine. And I know this sounds so deranged. I hope she's crippled or blind. But come on, give me a reason to care. Give me some narrative consequences. If they just have her sleep and then wake up all fine, well, I won't stop watching, but you better believe I'll be complaining online. Also, having those death scenes back to back also felt like a mistake. You were already emotionally exhausted, and so it did lessen the impact of Max's death a little bit. And I mean, yeah, she ends up coming back, but it still felt lessened. And so, those are my major complaints, but I do have a few minor complaints too. Sorry. For one, Russia. Oh, Russia. That whole plot was not it for me. It bogged down the flow of the rest of the story. Like, don't get me wrong, it wasn't bad and it was fun to watch. I enjoyed the scenes for what they were, and Hopper and Joyce reuniting was everything. But at the same time, it felt so disconnected from the main storyline that it was so much harder to care, and it really threw off the pacing of that final episode. Like, oh no, Steve, Nancy, and Robin are getting strangled. Max might die. She only has moments to live. She's getting attacked by Vecna. Shit. Let's cut back to the oldies breaking back into a Russian prison to fight the recycled villains from season 1 and 2, who are going to impact the defeat of the main villain somehow, because they're a hive mind. Although I will admit the scene where Hopper describes how he's been dreaming of his date with Joyce at Enzo's and then just listing off all the food he wants to order, that touched me on a spiritual level. Perfection. And another more minor complaint, are we seriously entering a shipping war storyline for season 5 with Steve, Nancy, and Jonathan? I mean, talk about recycled plot lines. I kind of thought, they're closing the door on that one when Jonathan arrives in Hawkins. But then he lies about the acceptance letter. And now I'm thinking they're going to break up off screen, as there's surely no way any self-respecting person does not dump him for such a douchey lie. But on top of that, I'd also be shocked if the planned endgame is Steve and Nancy. So this makes me fearful for all the storylines for them in season 5. Like, surely there were better stories that could be told with these three characters. I mean, poor Jonathan's been in a rut since season 2, and now it looks like they've joined him there. And then finally, whilst I liked the idea of 11 in Max's mind, I felt like this was a good chance to delve into Max's backstory a little bit, like we did with Billy. And then we just see her skating as a little kid, and then a bunch of memories of Max during earlier seasons. Stuff we've already seen. Like, what we got was still cool, and this whole sequence was one of my favorites, 11 versus Vecna, Max getting mutilated, I know that makes me sound crazy. The revelation of one's backstory after he was attacked by 11, the reveal that he's basically the Mind Flayer and that he shaped it out of the particles he found as he explored the Upside Down. And look, I know people don't like the whole, haha, he was the villain all along, ha 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 ha. But I don't know, I kind of like having a villain that can actually talk and you can understand its motivations rather than some eldritch god creature, which would never make sense as a final antagonist because it seems unbeatable. And hey, I realize that it seems like I'm just shitting on the show relentlessly right now, and I get it, I am doing that. But don't get me wrong, I did actually enjoy watching it, and it has some really great parts. Now obviously, during my earlier rant, I did list some things I enjoyed from the season, so I'm not going to go over those again, but there's still plenty of other things. For starters, the acting. My god, the fucking acting chops on these kids. What the hell? Like, obviously I knew by this point that the majority of the child cast were good to great. But it feels like every single actor got their own chance to really show off how far they've come since season 1. Will and Mike talking in the car, and Will's conversation with Jonathan in the Surfer Boys pizza shop, Eddie's death and Dustin's reaction to that, and then Dustin's conversation with his uncle, Max's whole death scene, Lucas and all his scenes, whether he's panicking about Max dying or portraying Vecna in Max's visions, just top-notch work from him too. Argyle and the stoner stuff, Robin and her awkward and sweet romance with Vicky, and even just some of the old classics like Eleven and Joyce and Hopper. Nobody really stood out as letting down the team. And the child actors, they're mostly adults now, kill me. They've really come into their own. And as usual, the music was also phenomenal. Seriously, there isn't much else to say about that other than the music has consistently killed it throughout literally every season. Whether it's the original tracks or the existing 80s hits that have added into the soundtrack, it just enhances everything. Whether it's the action, the drama, the comedy, it's just perfection. And acting aside a little bit, the storylines for all the younger characters were great too. Dustin being passed the baton of becoming a sort of leader of their group. Will, well, his story's still in progress, so I'll hold my judgment there. Mike realizing how special he actually is to the rest of the party. 11 telling Brenna to take his experiments and his psychological torture and to fuck off, leaving him dying in the sand with no forgiveness or redemption. Justice. Lucas deciding being a nerd isn't a bad thing and realizing where he belongs. It's all just good shit. I also liked how they managed to balance such a dark ending with a lot of humorous moments. Argyle remains one of my favorites. That whole scene with him at Surfer Boys was great. Whether it was talking to the stoner guy or teaming up with Al to feed Mike pineapple on pizza, it just lightened things really nicely. Oh, and also, we got an explanation as to why the hell we were supposed to give a shit about Billy suddenly. I'm really glad they explained why Max cares. That it wasn't just weird fraternal love suddenly, but it was more guilt that she wanted him to die, rather than actually caring about him as his stepsister. I'm really glad they cleared that up, because the dude was the worst. Like, I get why he became what he did, but he was still very awful. So yeah, I think that's my consensus. Good character progression for the most part, great acting, great music, great effects, but let down by the same writing pitfalls that many seem to fall into these days. So whilst I think it was still a great second half of the season, it didn't hit the highs that the first half did for me. But with all that being said, these are just my opinions, and now I'd like to hear yours. What did you think of Volume 2? Like it? Hate it? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know.